All right, we'll go ahead and get started. Thank you, folks, for joining. My name is Chris Neidl. I'm your host today for This is CDR, which is kind of an unusual episode because I'm also the presenter. So, as I advertised last week, really excited to be talking about uh, kind of a survey of state level carbon dioxide removal policy. And as I was working on this, I realized I had a few different options in terms of how I would frame it. So today I am going to kind of give some background on the importance of state level policy, the kinds of state level policy, the geography of state level policy, and then some updates on some recent and current legislative campaigns. And then I'm joined by my buddy and co-host Tank, who I know you've had a little bit of Wi-Fi issues, so hopefully it'll hold up. But you look crystal clear. How's it going, Tank?
Good. How are you doing, Chris? Hello, everyone. This is Tank, open air volunteer based in Taiwan. Yeah.
Great. And Tank is we're kind of switching chairs here a little bit, where I'm the presenter, and then Tank is gonna lead some questions and some discussion. But as always, please do throw your own questions and comments in the comments bar, and we'll pull those into the conversation as we go. So Tank, I'll pull you up in probably about 25 minutes or so to moderate. Awesome, cool. So what we're going to talk about today is I will pull up some slides here real quick and put it on the stage here. Just the standard This is CDR introduction. This is a topic we're talking about today, which is very central to the whole story and activity of OpenAir because it's focused on advocacy. So our all volunteer global network of CDR enthusiasts participate in a lot of advocacy. In fact, working on state level legislation was really kind of the first thing that we did. And I'll talk about that bill. But in addition to that, the types of activities that our members engage in have branched out. We have really cool citizen science projects, a number of different kinds of educational activities, of which This is CDR is one. And as we've had featured on recent webinars, we do often directly work on the creation of new enterprises or support for CDR companies that already exist. But you can find out more about that by hopping into our Discord. I'm also going to share, or rather Tank will shortly, we have a separate form today just so that folks didn't get lost on the Discord. If you are interested in state level advocacy, there's a very short 4-question Google form that will drop in there because we do have some live campaigns and some plans to push additional legislation as we get into the summer and look towards 2026. So you'll see that in the comments. We'll probably drop it a few times, but do join the community by jumping into our Discord, and Tank will share the link to that. So today, yes, that is me. I do want to, again, it's a perfect timing in the year right now to kind of really talk about what's happening at the state level in terms of forms of carbon removal policy that are either live. I also want to talk about some recent successes we had or experiences to give some context. But this is a great opportunity for people to get involved and to learn more. We have a pretty good record of success in OpenAir. Most of the state level legislation that's been introduced or passed in the US that pertains to carbon removal, directly or indirectly, has originated from OpenAir members. So it's definitely a very active area of our work. And as Tank and I talk, we will get into what that kind of activism looks like and how folks can get involved. Our mantra and sort of core value is that anybody can contribute. You don't need to be a specialist. In fact, the more non-specialists that participate in this, the better. So what I wanted to do today is go over, let me just let my dog, actually, it seems like he stopped. Sorry, I have a barking dog here. What I do want to go with today, again, is I had some sort of choices here. I could present just a sort of a deep dive on several specific pieces of legislation that are currently introduced, or I could kind of give a bit more of a framework for understanding, again, why states matter, what we can sort of expect to advance there, what the landscape is of different states and the kinds of policies we might expect or advance in particular places before going into a discussion of specific legislation. So that's what we'll do, but we'll have plenty of time to kind of get into the nuts and bolts of particular pieces of legislation and campaigns, which Tank will ask some questions in that direction, and we invite you all to do the same. All right. So let me get into this first subject here with why states matter to carbon dioxide removal. So why vis-a-vis the federal government or global multilateral agreements like the Paris Agreement, what is the specific, sort of role, why they deserve attention and energy? And to give you kind of a basic civics lesson, because we always assume that some folks might be completely new to the legislative process of any kind, federal or state. I want to just kind of define it a little bit in terms of what we're actually talking about when we talk about legislation. So as most, if not everybody who's tuning in probably knows, is legislation are the proposals that are put forward by elected officials, legislators, senators, or assembly members or representatives that are proposals for law. So these are the things that are put forward and go through a legislative process to ultimately become law. Very few pieces of legislation that are introduced anywhere ever become law or even become close to it, because there's a real process and a lot that is required to drive it forward through that process. And so the legislature, in wherever you may be state-wise, that almost always consists, I think, with the exception of one state, Nebraska, it has two bodies typically. You'll have a Senate, and then you'll have either assembly or a House, which more or less approximate to the federal Senate and the House of Representatives. And a bill or a piece of legislation that's introduced has to work its way through that process, go through committees, has to attract co-sponsors. And then ultimately, the other major player in that is the executive or the governor, who, if a bill makes it through, they have to sign it in order for it to become law. But the governor's office is often very involved in the whole process. In fact, they might introduce a piece of legislation through a legislator. They will weigh in whether they like it or not. The various agencies that are part of the executive often have direct roles in determining the fate of legislation as well. So those are the two kind of major actors that are relevant that have to be appealed to in order to make legislation law. And then this is an important thing that I really I'll probably refer back to a number of times, is that when we look at the function of legislation, why do legislation? And there's actually multiple layers to this. And the most obvious and immediate one is that what the legislation actually proposes to do has a use value. And that's why you introduce it. You want it to do that thing. So whether you're renaming a post office or you want to illegalize a chemical fertilizer, that's the purpose of the legislation. So that's the use value. But in reality, there's other functions of legislation as well, which sometimes play out indirectly or over a longer term period. And I just want to name those. And these are very relevant to carbon dioxide removal for reasons that I'll explain. Is one that we say getting a subject into the bloodstream. The world is complex. Policymaking is complex. You have a limited number of legislators and the staff who have to kind of know about these things, right? And so just getting a new subject into the conversation among legislators is really, really critically important. Ignorance or lack of knowledge is your worst enemy and is a major burden to overcome. So you want to get it part of the conversation. And then once you get a part of the conversation, you want to keep elevating it. There's a lot of things that legislators deal with. How do you make sure it doesn't get lost in the shuffle, but rather you can actually put it front and center in the field of vision of the legislators whose support you need? And so when you look at carbon dioxide removal, I don't know why that's throbbing, but it works. It's, around, let's just take climate or energy or environment. There's multiple different issues and subjects that are already part of that discourse, the things that people think about or care about, whether it's electric vehicles or renewable energy or banning gas, whatever that may be, that are already established. They're already sort of part of that discourse. If a new piece of legislation pops up around it, you don't have the whole burden of trying to explain what it is, right? And really, CDR is such a new field. Really, I think it kind of popped onto people's radar starting back in 2018. And it's been a process of trying to get it in that mainstream discourse. And in recent years, it's really kind of been on the outside knocking up until very recently. So our goal by injecting into the bloodstream and elevating is to get it inside of the conversation. So now when we talk about it, just like electric vehicles or solar panels, you're not starting from scratch. It's already kind of well implanted. And so that is a major goal when you introduce legislation. That can be a vehicle for just getting it into that discourse for the longer term. And another thing that's really important is that sometimes when we introduce a bill, there's a lot of urgency around carbon removal. You want to kind of shoot for the moon, right? Say, well, we got to do a whole bunch of carbon removal. In reality, sometimes what you do with legislation when you first introduce it is you're just trying to create a foundation that then opens up opportunities for subsequent legislation that maybe is more ambitious, right? So you want to kind of stake some turf within the legislature and create a foundation that can be leveraged again and again. And some of the examples that I'm going to point out really sort of, I think, illustrate that from our recent experience. All right, so now let's get into the arguments that we can make for why states matter, uniquely. What are the kinds of things that they do, and how do they play into the bigger picture of making CDR happen ultimately at scale in the United States and the world? So let me start with one sort of basic one. It's a mistake to just look at states as this sort of poor man's Fed, that they're little and that they're, kind of just insignificant by themselves. The way to think about states in terms of their punch or their impact is that, again, if you look at all 50 or clusters of different states, they wield significant amounts of resources and powers that are very relevant to carbon dioxide removal in many different ways in terms of policy. So obviously, the federal government has a much larger purse, right? If you look at, around $5 trillion in tax revenue in 2024. But if you add up, all of the different states, it's significantly lower, but it's over $1 trillion. So there's a lot of revenue that states are actually generating and deploying that's not trivial and that can be worked with when we think of different forms of incentives for carbon dioxide removal, et cetera. So it's a lot. Same if you look at purchasing power, which is a lever that we often look at. States and the federal government buy things. And that process of buying things can intersect in favorable ways with bolstering carbon dioxide removal demand. A lot of the policies, some that we'll talk about today, work with the procurement area of government to try to get CDR on the map and try to create a market. States cumulatively actually have more procurement power than the Fed, almost $2 trillion per year. So that's, again, not trivial. That's a significant purchasing power and procurement ability that can be beneficial to carbon dioxide removal in a variety of different ways. And then same when we talk about sort of land management and ownership, the federal government through the, Bureau of Land Management and other agencies, certain states out west, significant amounts are actually controlled by the federal government, over a quarter nationally. But states too. States have a significant amount of land that is managed under their purview, close to 9%. And that matters when we think of where we're going to do or put certain forms of CDR projects. So this is just a kind of a cross section to give you a sense that there's a magnitude to states, some individually, but many in aggregate, that is really quite significant, that really creates a framework for policy action for CDR. Now, again, when it comes to the powers and authorities of what states can actually do in terms of a government, they have significant powers. It's written right into the Constitution, Article 10 or the 10th Amendment, that states basically have whatever powers are not sort of prescribed by the Fed. States have those powers. But in addition to that, there's many things, and you look at the kinds of policies that and responsibilities that state governments have. Obviously, enormous purview over property related issues and land use and permitting. This is hugely significant for many different forms of carbon dioxide removal. Regulation of utilities and infrastructure. Many forms of carbon dioxide removal are integrated into existing utilities or infrastructure, or could be regulated underneath the agencies or authorities that are responsible for it. The states basically set a lot of the parameters around local governance, and many of the building codes and fire codes, many of those are drawn from international and national sources, but it's ultimately states that have the authority to set those in many cases. And those things like codes and permitting have huge implications for the ability to do carbon dioxide removal in a predictable way and in a cost-effective way. And certainly states regulate all kinds of corporate activities and also collect revenue through state taxes. So there's many different levers and areas of governance that states are responsible for that do overlap substantially with carbon dioxide removal policy opportunities. Now, this is another really, really important idea that you often hear. I can't remember who coined this, but the idea when you look at a federal system like the US, where states do have a lot of power or rights and authority, and you have 50 of them, that means that you're going to have all kinds of different policies that are sort of popping up organically in different states based on the economy, based on the values, based on the politics, a whole variety of different things that are relevant to that. And so when we, sorry, if I moved, give me 1 second here, guys. Sorry. Great. Let me just make sure I have the right, there we go. Great. And so the same thing with carbon removal right now, because it's new, creativity really matters. And we want to see a bunch of different ways of addressing carbon removal arising. And then over time, that'll sort of be sorted out. Some will be more effective than others. And this really points to another aspect of the laboratories of democracy piece, is that states, an individual state that's acting on any policy area, has influence both horizontally and vertically. And by horizontally, I mean a state might come up with a policy idea that then another state sees, takes, and adapts, and it sort of spreads from that origin state. So states sort of influence each other, and there's a history of that. There's certain patterns that we can kind of point to again and again, particularly in climate and energy policy. And the other one is vertically. Many of the biggest and most important, and also thousands of obscure examples of federal policy, federal legislation, trace their inspiration or origin to a policy that was first legislated at the state level. That's happened again and again and again throughout our history. And just to provide some examples, for that horizontal example, marijuana legalization. Now we have 24 states that in some way, shape, or form have legalized marijuana. Okay, that didn't all happen at once. It really can be traced back to Colorado and Washington over a decade ago, were the first to make that move. And that kind of created permission in a model for many other states to then follow subsequently. Smoking ban in restaurants. I used to be a bartender and a waiter before I got into this whole thing in my 20s. And it was New York was the first state in the US to ban smoking in restaurants and bars. And then rapidly, there was a succession of other states that did the same. And now we're at 28 states. It's hard to believe it's not 50. More relevant to our subject, again, New York, when it came to the first state that actually legislated that they have to reach net zero emissions economy-wide by 2050 in New York's case. New York was the first to do that. And then you had Massachusetts, California, and a variety up to 15 states do that. So that whenever we're thinking about a policy that we're trying to push for CDR in a particular state, you focus on that state, but you also realize that it has a ripple effect that can actually spread to other states. In certain states like New York and California are really, really important drivers that often are sort of the origin points of energy and climate policy. Now, this is supposed to show California. Let me go here. Yeah, so I'll move forward actually. So when we talk about the federal, more vertical influence that states have, just to give two quick examples with that, before we had the Affordable Care Act that was, became law under the Obama administration, or Obamacare, that was really inspired by Massachusetts legislation called, colloquially called Romney Care, that was first implemented there. That was the direct inspiration for it. And again, more pertinent to climate and energy, California has played an outsized role. Many different forms of federal legislation and state legislation throughout the country can be traced back to California. But the Clean Air Act, incredibly important piece of environmental legislation at the federal level, really can kind of trace its outlines and its origins to California doing that first, actually, in 1967. So another thing about states that's really important that I talk about, which is kind of reached an extreme sort of tension right now, policy continuity, right? When we have, right now at the federal government, we have this situation where it's sort of, the Democrats in control, the Republicans in control, and this sort of scorched earth approach that whoever comes in next is going to basically throw out whatever the previous administration did. We're seeing that happen right now. That is not healthy for successful policy in the long term, because policies aren't meant to operate for a year. They create the framework or an operating system for government. So if you keep having discontinuities at the federal level, that creates a bad outlook for progress in the longer term at the federal level. States, you have a lot of flipping, obviously, between parties, both at the governor level, or at the legislature level. But you have more continuity. It's less likely that you'll have a radical shift in a particular state that means you're going to have that similar kind of scorched earth type of policy. So there's just greater levels of policy continuity at the state level where you can keep building on things rather than having to start over every 4 or every 2 years. That's really, really important. And then one of the last things I want to mention, which really has implications for activism and how do you get these pieces of legislation introduced and then ultimately passed into law. When you're operating at the federal level, there's obviously an amazing tradition of grassroots activism and democratic participation, but it's harder in terms of the barrier to entries, the level of resources that you need to engage with a Congress member, propose a piece of legislation, and then lobby for it to become a law, not surprisingly, is harder. It's sort of more fortified at the federal level. With the lower levels of government that you go down to, you have more access to your legislators. It's easier to mount a campaign, particularly from a grassroots perspective, and then have it go through that process. And that's really important. And I like to show this picture here. There's the equivalent of these for congressmen at the federal level as well. But this is the office of Robert Carroll, who was the sponsor of the very first piece of legislation that we introduced through the OpenAir Collective, LECLA, which I'll talk about a minute ago. And this is his office in Park Slope. It's an open door. It's transparent. Looks like a bookstore. In fact, I think it used to be a bookstore. And so it just sort of represents or is symbolic, I think, for that. It's a lot easier to sort of make those connections regardless of what kind of organizations you have backing you. And then that also translates to a lot of the other parts that are required tactically to move a bill forward and get attention from the grassroots constituent mobilization. Like I just mentioned, it's less expensive to hire a lobbyist in Albany, say it is for Washington, to have a real impact. And then if you're doing any kind of comms play where you're going to actually try to get into a local paper of record, or you're going to try to do a social media campaign where you're buying, ads, it's cheaper, obviously, to do that at the state level. Okay, so now let me get into, before I do that, Tank, can you just let me know if I sound okay? I'm hearing some beeping that is coming up and on. So do let me know if there's any issues with my connection. Okay, Tank might be off for a second. So let me talk a little bit about the kinds of, when we talk about policy, it's hard to overstate how many different areas of policymaking are required to advance carbon dioxide removal. And I wanted to kind of go over those and then talk a little bit about, well, which kind of states are maybe best suited to different types of policy. There's not a one-size-fits-all policy to make CDR work at the state level at all. It's incredibly complex. A few different ways to look at that. This is a very broad categorization, and there's an overlap here. But what I typically think of is there's kinds of policies that I sometimes think of as enabling environment. So they create a more conducive environment to actually do carbon dioxide removal projects of all different sorts. Okay, and I'll give some examples of that in a second. So it's creating a sort of an environment at the state level that makes it easier and more predictable to do CDR. And then there's the things that you can call market making. We need to have more CDR companies, and we need to have more customers for CDR companies. Okay. And so there's a whole wing of policies that really focus on sort of supply side and demand side boost for carbon dioxide removal. So to get a little bit more specific, when we think about enabling environment, this is about how do you permit a project? How do you actually, are you legally to develop, a biochar facility or a direct air capture facility? A lot of that really is determined at the state level. Many different building codes, fire codes, are relevant to CDR projects, and you want to make sure you have a code regime that doesn't stand in the way of doing carbon dioxide removal projects. And then there's questions of liability. In the long term, when we're talking about carbon removal, there's pieces of the value chain that have to, by definition, last for decades, centuries, and even millennia, right? And so this creates some complexities for, how do you, look at business liability for geological storage, for instance? How long is that company going to be on the hook, and when is the state going to be involved, right? So these types of issues, you generally want a favorable enabling environment regime to make projects happen in particular places. And then for market making, here we're talking about, can states intervene in ways that help create demand for carbon removal, carbon removal credits or carbon removal offtakes, right? And then are there other types of policies that make it easier for carbon dioxide removal companies to operate in a particular state, make it more economic, make it more affordable, tax credits for companies, things like that. I would also put research and development to a degree. Are states doing research related to carbon removal that can ultimately be commercialized? So this isn't a perfect sort of breakdown, but it's useful, I think, is a way of broadly sort of thinking about different types of policies in broad strokes. Another way, which I'll illustrate through some examples in just a few minutes, are direct and indirect approaches. There's some places where you could say, this is my carbon removal law, and I want there to be carbon removal demand, and I'm going to name carbon removal, I'm going to explain carbon removal and why it's needed within the state, okay? But many times it's more indirect types of policies, right? Where the carbon removal thing might be sort of just tucked away in a much larger bill. We've done some bills around concrete, for instance, at OpenAir, which I'll talk about, where the carbon removal component for using carbon in concrete was tucked away in a much larger bill around decarbonization of concrete, right? And the indirect opportunities are much broader. The places where you can really make direct appeals to carbon removal support are a pretty limited number of states, which I'll talk about in a minute. So indirect, to think creatively about how do you fit carbon removal or embed it into a bigger legislative vehicle. And then there's also what you can call broad or narrow types of policies, right? So some policies that you propose, one example I'll give you in a minute is like in California, right? Where there's a very exciting carbon removal procurement bill. And that's going to cover a whole range of different forms of carbon removal. It's by definition kind of tech agnostic, right? Where other types of policies that you put forward might be very specific. You might have can we come up with a research bill or a tax credit for enhanced weathering in Oregon, right? And so some will be very, very narrow focused on particular solutions. Some will be much broader, right? So hopefully that's a helpful, there's many other ways that we could slice the cake, but I just wanted to put that forward as I describe some of the bills that I'm about to right now that have recently been introduced or passed and ones that are currently on the table, right? So for the state survey, before I talk about individual states, I want to give you a little bit more of a sort of a general map around where we see certain kind of patterns that are emerging. Let me let my dog out here. You probably hear him barking like a lunatic. So I want to just give you a little bit of a landscape about state level where we see certain sort of patterns that are emerging. Okay. So one is that there's a separation between those states that might, for climate reasons, be most likely to say, okay, we got to do carbon removal. We got to do carbon removal to meet our climate goals, right? Those you'd call the will states. They have the will to do it. We're working on them and we're using arguments that are related to climate to support carbon removal, right? And then there's states where we could call the way states. They have the way to do it, where they might have the best conditions physically and resource-wise, and sometimes from a regulatory standpoint, to do different forms of carbon removal projects, right? So things like, whether or not there's geological storage, does it have a robust biomass or agricultural base? Is it a coastal state, right? And these are not always the same states. In fact, there's a pattern where we see there's quite a bit of separation between the optimal way states for certain pathways and the optimal will states. And that creates kind of an interesting way for us to think about how to advance carbon dioxide removal policy. Now, the temptation might be to look at this map, which we've all seen with blue, red, and purple, that you might think, well, we're going to do carbon removal policy basically in the blue states that care about climate, right? And but that is actually not the right way to approach this. That's obviously something that has to be taken into effect, but that more helps set you on a course of what kinds of policies you're going to ask for rather than where you're going to actually try to get pieces of legislation introduced. This is another shorthand, which is highly relevant, as I'll talk about, where you can have certain legislative conversations and initiatives around carbon removal in those states that already have climate plans, or they're already trying to reduce their emissions, because then you could say, well, hey, look at the math here. It looks like you have some gaps. You can fill those gaps with with carbon removal, or you should. And that is indeed the core argument that we make in a lot of the most climate forward states like California, New York, and Massachusetts, Washington, Oregon, Colorado, right? But that doesn't mean that those other states don't play a relevant role, because if you look at other things where we know that carbon removal intersects or is embedded with other resource bases or other industries, right? Agriculture is a huge foundation for various forms of carbon removal, like biochar and enhanced rock weathering. Where are the biggest agricultural, where is the agricultural economy? Every state has agriculture, but which ones is it the biggest part? Does most of our agricultural production from? And you can see that map right there doesn't line up with red and blue. In fact, in the North Midwest and in the Midwest, which are often red states, are the biggest agricultural states. So therefore, they're meaningful and relevant to certain forms of carbon dioxide removal. You could also look at the map around geological storage potential. That has nothing to do with politics. That's been set for many, many millennia, millions of years. This is really relevant to forms of carbon removal like direct air capture and BECCS, where you want to look at where are the best opportunity. And those dark green and dark red splotches are where we have actually the most enormous and high potential to do geological sequestration. So that means those states are highly relevant to CDR legislation of certain kinds. Same, you could say coastal states. This is nonpartisan. If you look at the various forms of marine CDR that we want to get up and running, that is very bipartisan. That's very red-blue. That is not something that falls cleanly along partisan lines. Biomass availability tells the same story. Other things too, which you wouldn't think of immediately. Things like direct air capture, you want to go to where electricity is cheap and clean, because we need electricity for direct air capture, right? This is a map that shows where the most expensive and where the cheapest electricity rates are. So that's highly, highly relevant. And then renewable energy penetration, as well. Some of that falls along the red-blue axes, but not really. This is from 2020. Currently, Texas has the largest amount of installed renewable energy potential. So I bring all of this up to really drive home the larger point that all states, it's important to look at how relevant they are to different types of needs for carbon removal and plan a legislative strategy and a political strategy that matches that state. Okay, so now, again, some examples of specific states, if we kind of look at it a little bit more specifically, we have, if you compare kind of 3 states, right, in terms of will, right, different kinds of will or the absence of will, right? New York, as I mentioned, I'm from New York. I grew up in Albany. And it was the first state to declare, to put a net zero law on the books, right? It's very, very incredible leadership around renewable energy and emissions reductions. So you would think that that might be a conducive environment to come out with a bill, say, all right, let's do CDR. Let's do something really, really ambitious. We actually tried that. And because of the nature of environmental politics in New York, there's certain power centers that are very opposed to carbon removal, that are sort of on the grassroots side among the environmental community. So it's actually a very difficult place still to make a direct sort of appeal to policymakers to do carbon removal, right? California is different. California actually is one of the states that has made the clearest articulation and quantification of how much carbon removal is needed. And then you have Texas, where you're not going to be introducing bills around climate, but Texas has other interests in certain parts of the CDR universe that it looks at through an economic lens. And that's why you're seeing some forms of direct air capture and as well as ag-based and geological sequestration happening in Texas. So there's a lot of variety there around what is behind the will or what's behind the absence of will. And then there's the states, and I'll just point out a couple that overlap, that actually have the will to do it for a climate reason or for other reasons, and they have the means to do various forms of carbon removal. You can do different carbon removal in every state in the country because it's so diverse. But certain ones really sort of stand out in terms of their gigaton potential. Places like Colorado, which we'll talk about a bill that's been introduced there in just a moment, have both very, very clear goals around emissions reduction, and they also have the ability to do many different forms of carbon removal, including geological sequestration. Other Western states like New Mexico, California, as I already mentioned, Illinois, and up in the Pacific Northwest have, again, the ability to do massive amounts of carbon removal, as well as a climate will to do so. So let me go over some of the things that are going on in states right now, and then we'll stop in a few minutes and we'll have a conversation. And hopefully we can get some folks that are interested in participating in some of the activism around this bill to sign up to our forum and to jump into the action. So I'm going to go state by state. This is not all of the states, but again, I want to kind of illustrate for you, some of the sort of specific conditions and histories that make these states particularly interesting. So New York was the first state actually where OpenAir introduced its very first bill. This actually went back technically to 2018, but this bill wound up passing in 2022. And this was a bill focused on concrete procurement and creating certain environmental standards for that. So when the state buys concrete, it has to base part of its decision on the environmental impact. And when we introduced this bill, this was an example of an indirect approach. We inserted a little special incentive that would make it even more attractive to put carbon in your concrete and lock it away in there. They gave that a special type of advantage. Now this passed, but it passed in a sort of not a very specific sort of form that then ultimately led to what's called Buy Clean New York. And that is where the state has implemented a wide range of different rules around low embodied carbon for a variety of building materials. Now, what also happened at that same time, once we introduced New York, shortly thereafter, New Jersey, some of our activists in New Jersey introduced a very similar bill, which was actually a stronger version of it, and they passed it outright with almost entirely bipartisan support about 2 years ago. And that's actually finally getting implemented this year. And so that was an example before when I said horizontal influence. We introduced a bill in New York. We had some amazing activists in New Jersey stand up and say, I think I can get that introduced in New Jersey. And it spread that way and passed. Back to New York, though, for a second, this was a really important lesson that way back in 2022, actually, during the 2021-2022 session, we introduced a bill that was a very ambitious carbon removal bill that would require the state to procure carbon removal as part of its overall net zero picture. And looking back, we realized that was maybe a bit naive to move forward on that at that time when nobody knew anything about it. And that actually failed. That bill did not advance any further than just getting introduced in the Assembly and in the House. But we learned important lessons from that had implications going forward about how do we approach New York rather than coming at New York with a big picture climate CDR bill. Can we look at it sector by sector and try to fit in wherever we can? And that leads to a bill that's now currently introduced in the legislative session, which is called the Carbon Farming Act. And this provides would provide tax credits as laws for farmers that implement different forms of carbon farming practices, anything from no-till farming to silviculture, but also biochar. So this is a way of incentivizing farmers to actually adopt those practices. So any New Yorkers that are on the call right now, we're already calling our legislators and doing advocacy around it. Please do fill out the form and join us, and we'll give you some further direction. Now, I'll move next door to Massachusetts, which is a really interesting story. A lot of the northeastern states, New York, Massachusetts, throughout New England, they kind of often sort of work dynamically together around similar types of policies. And when we had our failure in New York, we actually were contacted by an amazing state senator, Cynthia Stone Cream in Massachusetts, by Twitter, who was interested in this bill. And so we took it and kind of licked our wounds in New York and got a revised version of it introduced in Massachusetts. And that bill went quite far. It made it through the different committees. We educated, again, got it into the bloodstream, educated legislators about, and the governor's office about what carbon removal is, why is it important for Massachusetts. And while it didn't pass in that exact form, because we were able to advance it, we were able to get carbon removal included in these two other massive bills, an economic development bill and a climate bill, that actually qualified carbon dioxide removal companies and projects for a whole range of different forms of incentives like tax credits, grants, and loan forgiveness. And that passed at the end of last year, which kind of put Massachusetts in the front of pack of states in terms of legislative support for carbon removal. Now, to go to Colorado, which is an incredibly interesting state because it's one of those will-way types of states right in the middle of the country. A few years ago, we OpenAir members worked really hard to get a bill introduced that would require the state to do a study of what is the carbon removal potential and carbon sequestration potential in Colorado, and what are some specific policy recommendations that the state and the legislature should then consider after that study's produced. So this was an example of getting a bill in that, through advocating for it, we educated a lot of people about what carbon removal is, and then it created a roadmap, which has been, I think it's finally released, but it's been circulated to legislators in the state, that included something like 85 different policy recommendations that the state should implement to try to make carbon removal really take off in Colorado. And that led to another bill that passed. That was, I think, the third OpenAir bill that passed. That then opened up the door for a bill that's introduced right now, which actually focuses on creating a system that helps manage the long-term liability for geological storage, so that geological storage companies aren't liable for hundreds of years, but rather after a certain point, the state will take over the liability for that. Very wonky, but very important to actually get investment in geological storage. But that came from that earlier bill that I talked about, that we got introduced 2 years ago. And I'm going to end. There's other places too, which we'll talk about when Tank jumps on. There's other hotspots in the Pacific Northwest, Oklahoma. But just to sort of wrap up a couple of these stories, I left California for last. It's a really, really big player, obviously, huge weight and magnitude that it has as a market maker. And it's the largest concentration of carbon dioxide removal companies in the world are in California. So it's massively important, and it's been a major focus of our efforts. So in California, for 2 years, longer than that, goes back 4 years of trying to recruit a sponsor, a senator, to introduce a bill that would catalyze carbon removal within the framework of California's own net zero goals. So looking at, we need to do carbon removal to meet a law that we've already passed. And so we worked on that for a good 18 months to get a sponsor. And that led to what was called SB 308, or the Carbon Dioxide Removal Market Development Act. And we spent 2 years trying to get that passed. And what it would do is it would create demand support where, starting in 2028 and going to 2045, more and more CDR would have to be purchased or funded to basically get to a very, very significant amount of carbon removal per year by 2045. So it was very ambitious. It was directly about carbon removal. And we got that through the Senate. We got that through our first committee in the Assembly, and we got it all the way to appropriations, where it ultimately didn't pass through. But one of the things that was really significant about that is that just by advocating for it, we built a coalition of 55 different organizations. We did lobbying days, we did site visits, we did all sorts of different engagement. We raised the level of understanding that legislators and other organizations had about carbon removal and why it's important. And it put us in a better position for new legislation, which is what we currently have. We have one bill, SB 285, which was introduced by the same sponsor as SB 308, Senator Becker. And this, importantly, would enshrine that CDR is a necessary part of California's net zero goals in statute. And that would also help define, what do we mean by carbon removal around durability and quality, which is really, really important to make sure that we drive the adoption of various forms of carbon removal, not just the cheapest and most available. So that bill has already been introduced, and I think it's going to its first committee next week. And then, oh my God, I deleted the slide. The other one, which is probably, I think, the most exciting piece of CDR legislation in the world right now, is called SB 643, and that's been introduced by Senator Caballero. And this is a procurement bill. This is where the state of California, it's an $80 million authorization, would start buying carbon dioxide removal from a variety of different suppliers that it pre-qualifies. This would be the most clear and direct demand signal that really has been put in place by any state, nations for that matter. And that has already, again, been introduced by a very, very significant senator. And it would help create the kind of the foundation for a longer term program once that pilot expired. But $80 million is not chump change. That would be a major signal to the market. And then hopefully, like in so many other instances, it would kind of normalize that idea for other states that are the climate forward states. Okay, so I know that was a lot of information. I had to make some choices there. But with that, I'm going to go ahead and stop the presentation, and we can have a discussion. And I'll bring Tank back up. Hey, Tank, how you doing?
Good. Thank you, Chris, for a very detailed state policy advocacy crash course, I guess, for me. Yeah, and I guess for a lot of folks as well. So yeah, should we jump into our discussion? Because I have a lot of questions for you. And yeah.
Yeah, let's do
So,
it. Yeah, we have
all right.
15 minutes, so we should cover some ground there.
Yeah, so to start, I think a lot of people know that OpenAir has been built on the advocacy side of driving CDR or events in CDR. But can you tell us a little bit about your journey into CDR state level policy or advocacy? Because
Yeah.
I think a lot of the focus has been on federal, right? And yeah, but you are the one who's always talking about the state level. Yeah.
Yeah, and a lot of it really, and I'll be quick on that, it really precedes my time in CDR. I've been interested in CDR since my 20s, which is a very long time in CDR terms, and always kept my eye on it while I was in the solar sector. And I worked in a variety of different capacities in solar in different parts of the world. But I got really hooked on legislation back over 20 years ago now. I can't believe it's been that long, where I worked on my first state advocacy campaign for a property tax abatement for solar in New York State. And I got really hooked on the policy process and organizing. I wound up going to grad school, focused on policy and creative forms of activism. So I was really into, within the New York context, which I still think is the hardest political state in the country. It's quite bruising. That's where I sort of cut my tooth around solar. And so when I came into CDR, I saw that my value add would probably be to work on policy. And because I had this familiarity with state policy, I started there. But through CDR, I was able to kind of work now, I think, on 9 different states. So that was really I kind of brought that baggage with me. But think that there's really important reasons I just laid out that we have to be working on states in tandem with our federal policy activism.
Okay, thank you. Yeah. Um, you talked about your experience in solar. So, from your experience, what have you learned, at like advocating the state level for solar that applies to CDR?
Yeah. I'll just focus on one thing that I think is important. Anybody who knows me for longer than 5 minutes will usually hear this from me is because I'm an old guy and because I come from another sector that, 25 years ago, people thought was a sideshow, was a novelty act. It was cute and you'd pat it on the head, but nobody really, seriously thought that it was going to be a major plank of the energy transition, particularly for electricity, right? So what I think I learned through that is not to project too far into the future based on current conditions. You have to just take for granted that surprises happen, both on the technology development side, on the market development side, on the policy side. And that as those things pop up, you have to opportunistically shift and exploit new things that happen, right? And expect new things to always happen and try to keep your eye on the road to find them. And because a lot of the arguments against CDR right now are things that I heard about solar when I was a very young man and just starting, is that, that'll never be real. That's too expensive. That doesn't work for this reason. And then as we're moving forward, we see, this new thing is starting to evolve. The costs have come way down because of something that happened in Germany and China. Batteries are becoming cheaper. New business models like community solar and power purchase agreements. So what I would say is just buckle up and be prepared to exploit new things that pop up and expect that everything that the most knowledgeable person thinks they know about CDR right now, most of it's going to go out the window and new things are going to emerge. And you need to be responsive to that as a policy advocate. But always bear it in mind when you get disappointed, say, no, new things are going to come on the horizon.
Thank you for that remark. I think, it gives a lot of, not hope, but like, I guess inspiring for us to think about what CDR could be, looking at how solar and other technologies as well has grown. But yeah, the idea of not focusing on what is going on right now. So let's talk about that right now. How do you see, the changes in the federal policy under Trump impacted sort of state actions? What have you seen any shift in yeah?
Yeah, definitely. So there's kind of a weird sort of two things, well, more than two things, but two major kind of countervailing forces, I guess, in a way. I was already in just in the earliest moments of my CDR career, early in the Trump administration, was still working in solar in 2016. And when we pulled out of the Paris Agreement, and Scott Pruitt, all these just horrible things were sort of happening at the federal level, that triggered a counter response from both state and local governments, where a lot of those net zero bills that I talked about, and the net zero commitments from cities and all sorts of things, more pressure started to arise, and particularly in certain states, bluer states that were climate forward, where they started to try to compensate for that by being much more aggressive on state policy, right? So we might be able to see something like that happen. I think broadly speaking, we will see that happening around climate and energy. Whether or not CDR makes that ship, or it creates a more conducive environment for saying, all right, now we really got to do carbon removal. Part of it still remains to be seen, because we don't know which parts of carbon removal support under Biden are going to be completely decimated, which things are going to be conserved. So, we still have a matter of, weeks and months, I think, for a clearer picture, if we ever get a clear picture. The other thing, though, is probably has less to do with climate policy or energy policy per se. It has to do with the bigger economic and geopolitical sort of situation, right? So, states depend on a lot of federal funds that come down, right? And if those are suddenly getting dozed away, something like carbon removal, which is kind of the last guy in, first one out, it's a pretty novel area. That might be the first one to be rejected in terms of states that now have more scarcity. They have to pay attention to, maybe just conserving the fundamentals of the energy transition, so that could be bad for carbon removal. Things with tariffs are just going to rise costs for everything, particularly in a lot in the Northeast states, with electricity prices going up because of, restrictions from Ontario and Quebec. All of these things make it very difficult fiscally to try to put forward anything with a price tag, right? So that could also be really difficult. Again, in real time, we're kind of track how those two forces kind of, which one ultimately prevails, and what is our sort of window of opportunity to propose CDR, policies.
Yeah, I think you talked about enabling environment and markets, and I think with the current administration, or things that are happening, and the states could make a shift, and that shift could be really good for carbon removal. Carbon removal could find its way in, or like you said, it might be the last one in, the first one out. So so it's interesting to think about it like that. You showed a lot of examples of hotspots of CDR in this at a state level. I like to ask you the opposite of that. Are there any sleeper states that you think that are involved and are as active, that might become a hotspot, have the potential to become hotspots in the coming years?
Absolutely. And I wish I had more time to talk about them. But certainly the Pacific Northwest, if there was a little bit more information about where things are going there, I probably would have included it with time. But they are just amazing climate policy, lots of sort of innovation sector stuff going on, cheap renewable energy, and potentially enormous geological storage potential, plus massive biomass linked industries in forestry and ag. And so we have some amazing activists like Mike Robinson, and a variety of people that are involved in activism up there. Jason Grillo, that have already made some progress in the Pacific Northwest in terms of getting innovation funding for CDR, studies for geological storage potential. So I would expect, if not this year, then next year, a lot of shift going to the Pacific Northwest for sure. That'll be very, very significant. I think that some of the other Western states, like New Mexico, very good climate and energy policy, very strong economic development arguments that could be made around certain forms of CDR that could really play in New Mexico, I think. I think places like Minnesota, which we're having sort of early conversations, really interesting from a policy perspective, but it has its own impressive CDR ecosystem there, and has some resource conditions that are conducive. And the same with Illinois. Illinois, I think, has really good leadership, and it has, in terms of ag, geological sequestration. And then there's a range of other, mostly red states too, in terms of them getting what we call primacy, where they would pass a law to be able to manage their own geological sequestration and well development. There's multiple states that have already done that, or in the process of trying to seek it. And that kind of then decouples sequestration from whatever chaos is happening at the federal government. So But then there'll be surprises. There'll be the New Jerseys and the Marylands and other places like that no doubt will pop up. And some of it is very personality driven. Do you have a great politician, and do you have activists that are really, kind of want to push for it? Then we make our own map, through our sort of advocacy. But, next time we tune in on this, I think that map will be, reshuffled a little bit.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I think what you said earlier about the will and ways, some places that they have will, some places that ways, and some places are a hybrid of both. And yeah, and I think that is not only true for, United States at the states level, but globally as well at, different provinces or different counties for smaller nations as well.
In a
Yeah,
couple
people
weeks, we are going to talk about a city initiative, which you're already familiar with. So more news on that soon. Cities have a huge role to play, not just in their own role, but they're the ones, almost the way that states influence the Fed. If you get a lot of city and local government activity, that is an incredible driver of state policy as well. So we will be talking about that before the end of April. So, and provinces,
Yeah.
we should have a Canada one too.
Yeah. Should we try and answer this question in the audience
Yeah, let's do it.
before we wrap up? Okay, so let me see here. So Beth, hope you can still hear me. Beth asks, is California going to standardize and publish their qualification criteria for purchasing those credits?
Yeah. So it
How do you think
definitely,
over it?
yeah, great question. It definitely depends on if obviously the bill passes, right? It will depend on, this is one of the real benefits of, we could do a webinar on any single kind of policy approach here, but obviously we were surveying today. But one of the things that's great about procurement is that that it taps into existing procurement standards, which for a century, good governance laws have been around transparency, showing, who is putting bids in, why are they selected, how are they going to be scored for. So all of that kicks in when we talk about CDR procurement. But independently of this bill, the other bill that I mentioned, 285, is trying to basically accelerate the rate at which those standards are going to be formulated, which then ties directly into the procurement bill. And at the same time, the California Air Resources Board just added new staff this year, and they're also starting to work on developments of standards. And that's significant for California and California policy. But as I've said before, with that horizontal and vertical influence, you could see if California really comes up with great standards around carbon dioxide removal, for what constitutes carbon removal, how is it monitored, how is it measured, a whole range of other states might just adopt the California model, or at least have an 80% done type of version. So that's why I think, as is often the case, all eyes, regardless of where you are or where you work, if you care about carbon removal, looking at what's happening in California and being involved in that is extremely important.
Right. So who can get involved, and how do we get involved?
So we just dropped, as I said, rather than coming into the Discord, I think I saw someone from Brooklyn who's in there and named the other places. Whether or not you're in a state that currently has legislation or are, and you might want to be involved, what we do is a citizen lobbying model plus the direct model. So everyday people lead this, like some of these bills I mentioned, like that New Jersey bill, it was really two people, you know what I mean? That really drove it as volunteers, Sean Mohan and Sue Dorward. We directly put our citizens at the front of it. And so we do things like citizen lobbying calls. We're already scheduling those. I got one on Friday with one of our members for our New York bill, testifying at committee hearings, going and doing. We did an amazing lobbying day last year in Sacramento with about 50 people, sharing things on social media. There's a whole range to be involved. So what I would say is, if you're interested in this, no matter where you are, even if you're outside the United States, there's just 4 questions on that form that we dropped in there. I just dropped it again at 11:55. Click on that, fill it out, and then I'll be in touch with you as these come in. But we'd love to get people plugged in, whether they're in an active state or a prospective state. It really is all driven by people. So do fill out that form, and I'll be in touch. Yeah, props to Sue, Heather. That's right. And many other people, Sean. We've got some amazing activates.
Yeah. Well, great. Thank you, Chris, for your presentation today. And what's our upcoming episode?
So next week we'll be off because I do have to travel, but then we're reconvening on the 8th. I just confirmed it. Last week, Paul Gamble, who's kind of an OG in carbon removal, he was one of the founders of Nori, one of the early kind of market intermediation platforms for CDR. And now he's a kind of an analyst and sort of thought leader in the space. And he published just this, got a lot of traction on LinkedIn, this really interesting think piece on, are we going about market building for CDR in an entirely wrong way? And are there other ways? And when I read it, a lot of what he said resonated with me. So I reached out to him. I said, let's have you on and let's have a conversation. And Tank, you and I will directly co-moderate that given your CDR FYI, work. But we wanted him to sort of unpack those ideas a little bit. And then we have a number of other ones I'm just trying to get on the calendar. We are going to have the city initiative one in the middle of April. And then we have a number of other ones that we'll add to our calendar. But next week we're off, but we'll pick up with Paul Gamble when we get back on the 8th.
Awesome. Well, thanks everyone for coming today, and yeah, see you in 2 weeks time.
Cool. Thanks everybody. See ya.